This is the second in a series of videos in which I'm attempting to repair and boot this vintage Mimi 802 computer. This is the chassis from it. In the first video I showed some repairs to the power supply that I'd made and briefly explained the supply. This is kind of an extra video and I'm just making it because something interesting has turned up. And it's the sort of thing that always fascinates me with vintage computers, and quite often they work when really they shouldn't. And some design errors go right back to initial design and manufacture, and they seem to have gone unnoticed for decades. And even through multiple production runs, the errors seem to persist. This one's a bit of an odd one. The power supply, as I said, is quite simple, and it has two cables coming from it in terms of its output. There's one that goes through to the main board, and it's got a simple connector on the end. We've got two wires for 5 volts, one for 12 volts, two grounds, and a minus 12 volt. And they go through, and the greens are the ground wires, and they go through to the connector, of course, on the power supply. And then we've got the floppy drive power. Now, although this power supply has got two 5-volt rails, it's got a high current one and a low current one. The low current 5-volt supply is not used on this machine. Everything's wired to the, or at least all the 5-volt rails are wired to the high current 5-volt out. And so what you'd expect when you plug this in is to get the voltages going to the correct places. But because I take a fairly cautious approach to powering up devices that haven't been switched on for a long time, I tend to do continuity tests to make sure that I'm going to get the voltages appearing that I expect to. And on this machine I came across something very interesting, so I thought I'd share it, and any comments on this would be more than welcome. So I've got the test meter. I've got it set to continuity. And it doesn't really matter what the resistance is, it should be pretty much a short circuit. So if we measure the floppy drive lead, we're going to ground on one of the connectors, ground to the other, and of course we get continuity. So I'll leave this probe in the ground connection, and then we'll go back to the power supply, and you can see that we are indeed getting ground power. However, if you look at the schematic for this power supply, then you'll notice that the outputs are actually all independent. They're all floating relative to each other. So you can configure this power supply however you want. So although this is a 0 plus 5 volt supply, it's actually used in this machine as a minus 5 volt supply, but it's not connected to anything. But it just depends on how you configure the grounds. You can have them as plus or minus supplies. So you can either do this on your wiring loom, or there are jumpers on the board. You won't be able to see them on this board, but there's a series of jumpers just on the other side of this connector, and that enables you to kind of semi-permanently jumper this out, so you can configure this with plus minus supplies or however you want. But there aren't any jumpers in those locations, so obviously it's relying on the wiring loom to create its ground paths. But if I now go to the connector which goes to the main board, then if I try to measure ground on this connector, although there are two ground wires, they're not connected to anything, or at least they're not connected to the ground that goes to the floppy drive cable. It's not a break in the wires. If I measure from here back to the actual connector on the power supply, it's fine. But this ground on the power supply and the other grounds are not connected on the supply. So there is a jumper that you could use to connect these, but it's not fitted, so there's no physical connection on the power supply between these two grounds. One ground being for the main board and one ground being for the floppy drive. So that kind of leaves a bit of an issue, which is if you were to plug this into the main board, then you won't get any power going to the main board. And the reason is that, again, if I come back to this connector and I put the probe in here and then buzz through the 5 volt rail, it's connected. So this is a common 5 volt rail. but because the grounds aren't connected, so if I move the probe to ground, it's not connected. So in other words, although it's 5 volt going to the orange wire on this connector, ground's not connected to anything. So I was scratching my head trying to figure out how on earth this could ever have worked, because if you I have tried powering this up with it not connected to the board, and sure enough there's nothing on this connector unless you connect your ground to this lead. And I started thinking, well, okay, what happens if we plug the floppy drives in? So I'll just grab a floppy drive and the floppy drive cable and get it connected up as it would be in the machine. Okay, so this is how the machine would normally be connected up. This is not one of the floppy drives from this machine, but the connections are all the same. We'll bring the test meter back in. And now I'll plug this probe into the ground lead on one of the floppy drive, or the spare floppy drive connector. And we'll go back to the power cable that's supposed to go to the main board, and we'll check the ground connection again. And then we'll go back to this connector, and still obviously there's nothing here. But if I now connect this to the main board, bear in mind this ground here, it's the 1, 2, 3, 4th connection from the end is the one that goes to here. So I'll just pop this back into the main board. And now if we test the same ground lead that I tested before, which is the 4th connection from the end, 1, 2, 3, 4, we're now getting continuity. So that's a dead short, and so we're getting ground. I don't know if you can see the meter there. So in other words, the way this machine's been wired up, and this must have been done at the factory because there's no sign that any work has really been done to this machine. It looks all original. So the power going to the main board is not going through its power cable. At least the ground isn't going through the power cable. It's coming up the floppy drive power lead, and then it's going back down the ground signal lead in the floppy drive cable, and then back to the main board. So the ground cable in this, which is where all the main current should be going, is doing nothing at all. It's not connected to anything at the power supply. So as I said, it's just never had the link there. I had assumed or thought maybe someone was repairing this, took the board out, removed the link for some reason, but it's never been there. There's no residual solder or anything on the board, so that link was never fitted. So this is how it's always been on this machine. It's always relied on the ground, the signal ground on the floppy drive cable, and there's quite a lot of current goes through to this main board. It's a couple of amps, so I'm kind of surprised this machine ever worked. Chances are it may have been a bit flaky and unstable. Perhaps it used to quite often crash, and the owner never quite figured out why. But certainly if you've got a Mimi 802, I suggest you try this. And so just to clarify that the connection is indeed going through the floppy drive, we'll do a continuity check between the power supply, and I'll remove the floppy drive ribbon cable, and you can see the connection disappears. I'll put the cable back in, and you can see we get the connection back. I'll remove the power connector, connection disappears, put this back in, and we get the connection back again. So it's definitely going through the floppy drive. And of course, one of the dangers with machines like this that use multi-rail DRAMs, as I've said in previous videos, if you deprive the DRAMs of one of their 3 rails, it can destroy them. And of course, when the machine's wired like this, if you were to unplug the either the power cables or the floppy drive cable from the floppy drives and power the machine up, you could easily destroy the DRAMs on the main board. So this is obviously not an ideal situation. I'll contact the owner and see if he wants me to put the links on the power supply. It is possible, of course, the power supply has been exchanged at some point and the original had the correct links in, and the whoever swapped it didn't put the links back in, but there's no sign that this has ever been changed, so it is a bit of a mystery. But certainly I would recommend that the links put in and the actual power cables used to conduct the power, rather than passing this through the ribbon cable and also of course through the floppy drive board itself. As I said, there's several amps flowing to the main board, and could be even more if you start using accessories, so it's a bit of a strange one. But as I say, it's one of those interesting things that you quite often find with vintage equipment like this.